Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about, are we living through in the West a globalist, centrally planned economy? And by that, I don't just mean monopolies, oligopolies, and cartel pricing, although there's definitely that, but that the cost of living in each Western country is almost exactly the same, and varying sort of from rural to city and things like that. But even that, like if you take a rural city in Australia and then a rural city in Canada or Britain or the United States, the price of the real estate relative to the average incomes of the area, it's about the same. In fact, incredibly the same. And the same could be said for foodstuffs. The cost of food is priced relative to the cost, relative to incomes. So again, it comes back to that cost of living equation. So it would appear, if it doesn't appear, it's happening. I don't think there's any question of that. Whether it's 100% uniform everywhere, that I could sort of accept as maybe up for debate, but that it's happening is beyond question. And then I'll come back to a few examples on that. That really the cost of living is now rigged. It's not. It's set. It's centrally planned. The globalist sort of cabal is deciding that our standard of living will be reduced and will be pushed downwards by increasing the price, not of consumer goods, consumer goods that we can choose to buy or not to buy. They're still quite competitive in the main, televisions, for example, but forcing us to pay for things that we have to have. So the cost of essentials, housing, energy, that sort of thing. Transport, the cost of housing or the cost of living for the essentials has been pushed up at an incredibly uniform rate all across the Western world. Now, this is, you could say, well, that's just big multinational corporations, and they're looking at profit extraction, so they're charging the maximum amount they can, sustainable price they can in each area relative to what people can afford to pay. And there is, by the way, some argument to that, but I'm talking about it's across the board, small business, large business, everyone's in lockstep. So the cost of living in one city in Australia is going to be the same as the cost of living in the city in Canada, same as the cost of living in Britain, same as the cost of living in the United States, same as the cost of living in the biggest city in New Zealand, for example. So there's this, and by the way, elsewhere, whether it be Paris or somewhere in Europe, that uniformity of price. Now that wouldn't happen. There are just way too many variables in terms of inputs that go into what the cost of something is, whether it be the cost of a house or some countries have vast amounts of energy on tap, others not so much. Others have vast amounts of cheap, easy to get to coal. Others have no coal, and so on. So there's a lot of variables there that would affect the price of things. But somehow it's all ending up in this incredibly uniform pricing of all the things, but relative to incomes. So if income, for example, if income's $200 one place, then the cost of the packet of breakfast cereal is $2. But if the average income is $100, down from the $200, down $100, then the breakfast cereal is $1. But it's maintaining that relativity of the cost of anything you need relative to your income. That equation is staying in very tight lockstep. So that just couldn't be a random natural organic process. Just as plain can't be. Now, when I first started business traveling as a young guy in the early 1980s, very young, and I noticed that there was a huge difference in pricing of things like real estate, and And this is across the Western world primarily. I mean, you'd expect differences in the third world, of course, but in comparable economies, there was a vast difference in pricing. Now, some be a big city, or some cities had a big residential downtown. Others sort of had a more suburban type residential belt, and so there were differences there. But really, the variables in price were quite substantial. And you could see why in some countries they had a very high standard of living, because incomes were even if they were the same as you get in downtown Sydney, the cost of buying a house would be half as much, for example. So you would therefore have, by extension, a much higher standard of living. If you could acquire the essentials of life and some of the luxuries even, and you could acquire them at a much lower price, dollar for dollar, much lower price than you could elsewhere. And if incomes were about the same, then you had a much higher standard of living. On the flip side, if the cost of things were on or about the same, housing, energy, whatever, but the incomes were twice as much, then again you had a higher standard of living, and there was a huge variance in standard of living between places. So the standard of living in the United States, for example, was vastly higher than it was in Britain, and the same with Australia. Now, that's why a lot of people were emigrating, the big migration waves of white people. White people were leaving places like Britain or Europe, parts of Europe, and going to for example, the United States or Canada, Australia, because they have a much higher standard of living. The incomes were just as good or better, but the costs were less. You could buy either a much nicer house for the same price, or you could buy the same sort of place you had in England, but for a lower price. Now, I'll again, there's no question this is happening around the Western world, and there's no question it's being driven centrally. You can't get exactly the same outcomes across so many different jurisdictions if there's no central planning, because again, the variables are just too great. The input variables are too great. That would create different outcomes. But because the outcomes were all the same, then it must be centrally planned. By extension, it has to be. Now, just looking at, and I'll use Sydney as an example here. Now, here's a house that was $25,000 in 1972, so it's quite a bit above the average house price, probably 40% above the average, maybe more. But now to pay a mortgage, assuming you put the deposit down, to pay a mortgage on that house in 1972, you would be paying $300 a month. $300 a month. Now, given the average income at the time, that was around 22%, give or take, of your income. Now, and that again assumes the average. Now, that same house today, if you want to buy it, again, assuming you put the deposit down, that same house today, to service the mortgage would be $15,000 a month. So from $300 a month in 1972, it's now $15,000 a month. But incomes have only gone up, give or take, depending on whose numbers you want to use, between 9 and 10 times over that same period. So that means to pay that mortgage today, you would need, in terms of average wages, you would need 4 times the average wage to be able to service that mortgage, probably 5 times the average wage just to be able to service the mortgage, assuming you had children or you're paying cars off and, got loans for things like furniture and so on. Then you'd have to have a lot more. So that just illustrates how much more money is needed today to live the same lifestyle as you had in 1972. So we're looking in terms of real estate, in whether it be rent or servicing a mortgage. And this is average house price, by the way. It's average wage. If you want something a bit better, you want the tree-lined street in the nice area, with the good schools nearby, that sort of thing, then you're paying substantially more than this. But you need you need a considerably more. Well, just rent and average rent and average mortgage servicing cost. It's 3 times more expensive, even after adjusting for wage differences. It's 3 times more expensive in cost of living terms than it was in 1972. 3 times, in fact, a little bit over 3 times. Now, food, and I've done videos on this before, but food now is, because of the recent inflation, is around 50% more expensive in purchasing power terms. Again, that's adjusting for all the wage increases. 50% more expensive today, and energy is double what it was in 1972 in terms of cost of living, and getting worse and quite deteriorating quite quickly. Motor vehicles, public transport, and probably a little bit cheaper actually, but only marginally. And motor vehicles are more expensive. You get a lot more car now than you did back in the day. Things like sound system or air conditioning and are standard in a lot of cars, where they were very expensive options back in the day. So you get quite a bit more. So one cancels out the other, give or take. So motor vehicles are probably about the same overall. But even so, the cost of living on the essentials, food, energy, shelter, and also the government supplied facilities. A lot of these have been sold off to the big international financial cartels. Things like owning the water supply and so on. So they're more expensive now relative to incomes. So it's quite a bit more expensive now to live just an average lower middle class lifestyle than it was in 1972. Now, how and why did it deteriorate so quickly? Within a couple or 1.5 generations, how did it deteriorate so quickly, and how did it deteriorate so uniformly across the whole Western world? That's clearly impossible if it was organic and natural. So we've got to ask who's pulling the strings there. Now, it's the globalist cabal, obviously, but part of their shtick and gig is to reduce our standard of living in the West to the point where we will all have to eat insects and the like. So this is an interesting one to ponder. Just how is this being centrally planned? Where is it simply collusion between the big international financial houses? Is it the World Bank? Is it the World Economic Forum? Is it all of the above? But it clearly is happening now. The political elites have been very willing to sell us out. In fact, they've fallen over themselves to sell us out. Their fellow citizens, their voters. The fucking assholes. But they've been richly rewarded and bought off with cozy real estate deals. So for any Western politician now, 50 to 90% of their income is made up from real estate speculation. Now, these are people that know nothing about real estate, know nothing about business, know nothing about investment. And yet they somehow are uncanny in their ability to pick these insanely lucrative real estate deals. But of course, that's not the case. They're not picking anything or choosing or deciding anything. The globalist controlled financial end of town is giving them, steering them into real estate deals and then steering them into a very rich Chinese investor who's going to pay a million times the market price. And so the politician will do very well, and as a result, globalization is fantastic. I make millions out of flipping real estate. So looking at to give you an illustrated point of how they do it, there's a city in Australia that had a population a little over 1 million, and this is some years ago, but it had its real estate was very cheap. Its industry had been decimated. It had been quite an industrial hub, but the industry had just almost disappeared. It was trying to transition into a sort of service economy, so it had very low wage jobs. So the average wage for a manufacturing worker was, for example, $50,000 at the time was $50,000 a year, but they were being replaced with jobs that paid $30,000 a year in working in retail, things like that, and working in other services. So there was never been less money running around there, washing around in this economy, and the prospects were poor. People were leaving the place. Houses, when they put up for sale, were some houses were up for sale for more than a year, 18 months, 2 years in some cases. So the lead time to sell a house was going down. There was less money around. It was in fact the poorest city in the country by far, and yet the real estate in the space of 10 years increased by 400%. An impossible outcome, given there was so little money chasing so much real estate. Everyone was trying to sell. It was taking forever to sell, that sort of thing. So that's a case where the supply of housing is vastly exceeds the demand, and yet the real estate was still able to go up by 400% in 10 years. So this is again an illustration of how easy it is for the way the globalists are arranging, how easy it is to just create a price that has nothing organic about it, that there's nothing natural about it, no supply and demand. It's just cabal, cartel, controlled and delivered, and that's how it is. And this is something that we're seeing now in all asset classes. Now, when it comes to transport, like say motor vehicles, we're now being forced in a situation where we have to buy considerably more expensive cars, the electric vehicles and that sort of thing, that cost twice as much as petroleum-powered vehicles. So now in that asset class as well will be added to the additional cost of living. Similarly, with things like meat and those sorts of things in the West we've taken for granted. That those asset classes are now targeted by the globalists using very artificial means. The cows will end using climate change as the cover story. So we're seeing this centrally controlled thing, and of course, no Western government is opposing it or pushing back against it. They're all going along with it. They're all globalist flunkies at the end of the day. But that's what's going on, and I think our politicians, particularly after the November midterm elections, when there are politicians that we hope can get into the American Congress, the United States Congress, who actually believe they represent the people who voted for them. And it's time for those people to be asking some very serious questions. Why has the cost of living gone up so dramatically and uniformly across the Western world, regardless of local conditions and circumstances? We need the answers to this. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.